Okay, I'll start the session then. So welcome everyone. We're delighted to have you join us for this special guest seminar. So this guest seminar series is organised through the Centre for Digital Trust and Society. The centre represents one theme in our wider Digital Futures community, which brings together over 1,000 researchers to address the challenges and opportunities that arise in our digital world. And these guest seminars are intended to bring in expertise from around the world at the cutting edge of digital trust and security research, and are open to everyone. So we encourage you to post questions in the chat box, and following our speaker's presentation, we'll have a wider discussion as well. So let me now introduce our speaker. So here at our first guest seminar of 2022, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Cassandra Cross. So Cassandra holds the position of Associate Professor in the School of Justice at Queensland University of Technology. She's also the Associate Dean for Learning and Teaching for the Faculty of Creative Industries, Education and Social Justice. And just earlier today, we had a chat about the increased responsibilities that these kind of administrative roles place upon us, and it can be very challenging for research purposes, but as you'll see, Cassandra is still doing lots of great work in this area. She recently completed a 2-year senior research fellowship with the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre, exploring romance fraud victimization. And she's also an international expert on fraud, having worked with victims and related organisations globally. And in 2011, while working for the Queensland Police Service, she was awarded a Churchill Fellowship to examine the prevention and support of online fraud victims worldwide. Since taking up her position at QUT in 2012, she's continued this research, publishing over 70 outputs across the policing, prevention and victim support aspects of fraud. And further to that, she's been awarded over 1.3 million Australian dollars in funding, largely to drive her research in this area. And of interest to many of you will be the co-authored book that she has on cyber fraud with Professor Mark Button, who I can see is in the audience. So it's nice to see you, Mark. And on cyber fraud, scams and their victims, that was published by Routledge in 2017. So that's a brief introduction to Cassandra, and without further ado, I'll hand over to you to start the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. It's a little bit exhausting to listen to some of those things sometimes. Hi, everybody. My name is Cassandra Cross, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. I really wish I could be there with you in person, but alas, I'm here in my lounge room. It's 9 o'clock at night, so the time difference isn't terrible. I've done a few of these, I was saying to Nick before, at 2 a.m. So this is a much nicer time slot. I'm going to be talking today, the presentation's entitled Fraud in Australia, but more specifically, I am going to focus around romance fraud research that I've been doing recently. So as Nick mentioned, I have just come off a few months ago now, a senior research fellowship with the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre. And a main part of that fellowship was looking at romance fraud, victimisation here in Australia. I know that there are a number of you that are in attendance this evening, this morning, this afternoon, who have knowledge and expertise in this area, and I'm really excited and thank you for your attendance, and I'm looking forward to the discussion at the end. So teams and I don't usually get along, so let's cross our fingers that this works. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the lands upon which I live and work. So I in particular acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners and custodians of the lands upon which I live and work. And I wish to acknowledge their elders past and present. Although, as I mentioned, there's a lot of you on this in attendance who are well versed in fraud, it's always good, I think, just to have a definition up front so we have kind of a consistent understanding of what fraud is. So the objective of fraud essentially is all about financial advantage through the use of deception. So fraud is not new. Fraud is not something that technology has driven or invented, I should say. It's not something that the pandemic has invented. It's been around for a very long time, but it certainly has evolved. And the past decade or so, with the evolution of technology, with the internet, with COVID and us living our lives in a virtual and online environment, we've certainly seen fraudsters flourish in this environment. There's different ways to perpetrate fraud, and I think whilst a lot of fraud does focus in the virtual environment at this point in time, it's important to recognise that there are other methods which are still used by offenders. So fraud still occurs across both online and offline contexts. Technology has, I would say, exponentially increased the ability of offenders to target potential victims, and we've certainly seen that from the COVID-19 pandemic, when the entire world essentially was pushed online for doing both business and personal, and essentially living our lives in a virtual environment. And we have seen offenders take advantage of that, and victimisation figures skyrocketing. And there's been some really good research by some of those that are in attendance today who have done that research. If we look at fraud statistics, so here in Australia, the latest ones that we have are for 2020. So I'm expecting the 2021 stats to be released probably the middle of this year. So in Australia in 2020, there was $851 million that was recorded lost, which was up from 632 from the year before and up from 489 the year before that. So there's been some significant increases in terms of the reported stats for fraud here in Australia. I have fairly good relationships with the Australian Competition Consumer Commission, and in a recent conversation with them, they are expecting a significant increase in reported fraud for 2021. And also, I mean, even this year, we're only in April and we've seen some significant losses already. This is mirrored across the world. Fraud is not an Australian problem, it's certainly a global issue. So if we look at just some of the stats with the US, it's significantly increased to $3.3 billion. Canada is 160 million, up from 121. And Hong Kong, I've been doing some work with colleagues in Hong Kong and with, I guess, some countries in Asia, and it's significant to note that the victimisation stats mirror the increases there as well. And as I mentioned, we've seen significant rises in financial losses globally attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic. So from my perspective, the pandemic has really changed the vulnerability profile, I think, across society in terms of levels of anxiety, the way that we are conducting our lives online, and offenders have really been able to leverage that in ways that they previously couldn't. And sadly, we're seeing statistics that reflect that. This is just a quick graph that I did find of fraud statistics in 2021 here in Australia. So it hasn't been released and isn't verified yet. But if we look there, the current year is 2021 versus the previous year, 2020. There have been some fairly high losses in 2021 compared to what was 2020. And we already know that that was an increase from the year before. So it will be interesting to see what that final figure is when it gets released later this year. My estimate is that it would definitely go over $1 billion here in Australia. And I think the frustrating part for me and for many in this area is that we continue to see year upon year this significant increase in financial losses that are reported. And yet we don't really see a commensurate level of action from police or from government or from anyone really in terms of seeking to address the problem. And of course, those of you that are in attendance would realise that the fraud statistics are only a small minority of fraud that actually occurs. So we do know that fraud is one of the most underreported crime types. Several studies estimate that less than 1/3 of fraud is ever reported. So if we think about these statistics just in and of themselves, they're quite significant and quite horrific in many ways. But to think that that's only really the tip of the iceberg for actual losses that are incurred, and to also recognise as well the importance of noting non-financial losses. So fraud is very much not just about the money that individuals lose, but it has significant ripple effects across the well-being of individuals, both physically, emotionally, relationships, and can have impacts across all aspects of one's life. If we just think about why fraud is successful, I think we underestimate in many circumstances the ability of offenders. Offenders are highly skilled tech-savvy individuals who very much know how to identify someone's vulnerability, and they know exactly how to manipulate and exploit that. And I've seen that many times in the research that I've done, particularly when I've done interviews directly with victims. I've seen that across the many reports that I've read, and there are many in attendance today who have similar experiences in terms of the research that they've done. I think we also need to recognise that offenders work in groups to target victims. So the role of organised crime in fraud is something that I don't think is necessarily as well documented as it is in other contexts. And I think that is something that does require further attention, but it is difficult in some ways to accurately understand that and to map it. In terms of how offenders operate, certainly from my experience, they bombard victims with communication across all platforms. And I think that's why it's important not to just pigeonhole fraud in some ways as being an online phenomenon at the moment. In Australia, if we look at some of the stats that the ACCC released as part of their annual report, the telephone is still the most popular method of communication in terms of offenders and fraud. So it's significant that we do recognise the various platforms that offenders can use to perpetrate their offences. Offenders always have an answer for any question that they are asked. They have this innate ability to always be potentially plausible in some ways, and I think the pandemic has really played into, I guess, a number of scenarios around that. And the last one there, I think, is really challenging for all of us in that victims don't believe that they're susceptible to fraud. So nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, great, I'm going to be a victim of fraud today, I'm going to lose my life savings. It's not something that people really identify with. And therefore, I think it's really challenging to be able to put together a prevention message that does target, I guess, potential fraud victims successfully, because there isn't really that connection between the message, between victimisation and those who experience it. And we do know as well that there's a significant level of victim blaming and negative stereotypes associated with fraud. And that creates a significant barrier in terms of disclosure and reporting. If we look at the way that offenders actually do this, we do have research that documents some of the techniques, the successful techniques of offending. So offenders do use a range of social engineering techniques, and I guess some of the most popular ones that I've seen in some of my work have been through the use of authority, through the use of urgency and scarcity. And we see them across different types of fraud. So across investment, across romance, across many of the different approaches. Some of the work that I've started doing that I would like to explore a little bit further is looking at applying psychological abuse tactics and coercive control and how that manifests itself within a fraud environment. Certainly within some of the romance fraud narratives that I've had from victims, there is strong evidence to suggest that offenders do use these types of techniques. And I think it's really interesting in terms of thinking about fraud and thinking about it in an online environment where the victim and the offender are likely in two very different physical locations. There's no proximity there. They're in many circumstances kind of a world apart. And yet the offender is still able to exert an enormous amount of power and control over the victim, and they're able to persuade them to send ridiculous amounts of money. So I think it's interesting to be able to perhaps examine that a little bit further and to better understand how offenders are able to use those techniques and potentially how we can counter those techniques from a victim perspective. So today I'm going to be talking particularly about romance fraud. For those of you who have Netflix, it's having a little bit of popularity on there at the moment. I mentioned to Nick before, there's quite a few documentaries at the moment. So Tinder Swindler, I'm not sure if anyone's seen that recently, but it very much looks at romance fraud, not necessarily in an online context, but that is an example of face-to-face defrauding of another person. There's a few different documentaries out there, Inventing Anna, Bad Vegan, that are starting to explore fraud. And I think that's good in some ways, but also problematic for a number of others. And that's probably a future talk that I could look at. But romance fraud is the essence of romance fraud is using the guise of a genuine relationship to gain a financial reward. So from my experience, this is the most brutal. I think this is the type of fraud that has sometimes the most significant impacts, because it's not just about the loss of money that occurs, but in many circumstances, victims have to grieve the loss of the relationship. They have to deal with the loss of trust and the feeling of violation and betrayal from the offender. And many victims do express the difficulty in dealing with that part of it. And in some cases, they would argue that that's actually worse than the monetary losses and the impacts from that. So romance fraud can be initiated across a range of communication platforms. So whilst we would expect this across online dating apps and websites, we are seeing an increase across all types of social media platforms. So Facebook, there's examples of Word with Friends and kind of other seemingly benign apps where there is a communication outlet, and offenders are getting in and using that ability to connect with a potential victim to exploit in that way. And it seeks to manipulate and exploit the desire of a person to connect with others. And I think that's why in many cases this is the most difficult one, because it does seek to take advantage of that genuine need and desire that we all have to have a connection. And whether that's a romantic connection or whether it's just platonic and that of friendship, it's really difficult and really challenging once the offender is in there and has built that trust and rapport with a victim to be able to break that. So before I launch into my own research, I just wanted to bring the attention of Brian Denny. I think he's a really good example of both of the topics that I'm going to be talking about today. So Brian Denny may be familiar to some of you. He's a retired Army colonel from the United States, and he has had his identity stolen multiple times and used particularly by romance fraud offenders across the globe. So he's had victims here in Australia. There was a documentary on one of the news channels probably a while ago now. Time is a little bit redundant with the pandemic, probably pre-pandemic, looking at romance fraud and doing interviews with some victims here in Australia who believed that they were in a relationship and dating Brian Denny. He is doing a lot of advocacy work in the United States to try and, I guess, change the situation and put greater onus on some of the platforms to do more, particularly Facebook, in terms of their regulation and their ability to remove fraudulent profiles that appear. So he is sadly a really good example of a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about romance fraud. So the data set that I have, I've published a few things on, and both papers that I'll refer to today are published and available open access. So anyone who's interested can look them up, or if you contact me directly, I'm more than happy to send them through to you. So the data that's underpinning a lot of my research at the moment is a data set on romance fraud reports that was obtained through ScamWatch. So ScamWatch is an online reporting portal here in Australia. It's hosted by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. I guess what's important about it is that it has no human screening, no human intervention. It's simply an online reporting mechanism. The ACCC aren't law enforcement, they're a consumer protection agency. So they don't actually have the ability to do individual investigations around these types of fraudulent complaints. They do partner with a number of agencies around disruption and do a lot in the prevention, education and awareness space. But it's a website where people can go put in their complaint. The ACCC use the data for education and awareness, and they compile the annual report that I referred to earlier. So I was provided data for the period from July 2018 to July 2019 inclusive, so it was 13 months. There was initially 4,358 reports filed during this time. And when people file a report, they click a box as to whether they're happy to share it. So about 80% of individuals who made a complaint were happy to share that report for research and other purposes. So that's the data that I was able to receive. Each report included a variety of demographic details, details about the fraud itself. They have a number of vulnerability indicators. which are interesting but don't provide any guidance on the website. So it's really up to the individual complainant as to whether they self-identify with any of those. And for me, what was the most interesting and I guess the most valuable was the de-identified free text field. So for every report, there's a mandatory free text field where complainants can really write whatever they're comfortable with. So you can imagine there was a variance in terms of the level of detail and in terms of the length of the report that each individual provided. Some was really quite short, 1 or 2 words. Others provided quite a significant long description of the incident that had taken place and the impacts and what had happened. So upon cleaning some of the data and just going through removing duplicates, I've been left with just over 3,000 reports, so 3,259 distinct reports that I've underpinned most of my analysis from. So the first aspect of this that I want to talk about is the use of military profiles. So from my perspective, I was just really interested in this, having seen individuals like Brian Denny in the media and talking in different arenas, and also just through the victim interviews that I'd done. In many circumstances, the individual was in a relationship with someone who was in the military, and that was an attractive, I guess, attribute in terms of the victim being attracted and connected in the first place. So I was really interested in looking specifically at the military narrative and how it manifests itself within romance fraud. I was looking particularly at the following, at how the narrative was used. And this was, sorry, I should also say, this is with my colleague, Professor Tom Holt from Michigan State University. We worked on this particular analysis together, and Tom's been brilliant in terms of working with me in different aspects of this. So what we did for this particular paper, I'm presenting the qualitative analysis today, looking at how the military narrative was used by offenders. And I was just interested in whether it was the same or different to what we currently know about romance fraud and advance fee fraud in general. So in terms of this particular analysis, there were 463 reports where it was explicit in the free text narrative that the individual was communicating with someone who purported to be from military. So to do that, I went through and coded manually each of the free text narratives. There were some keywords that I could do some searches on, obviously around army, military, soldier. The US military identity is very strong, but there were some Australian military, I guess, identities being used in there. So what this analysis found was really kind of 2 distinct categories of narrative. So the first one is where the military identity is actually incidental to the romance fraud narrative. So the military identity, I would argue, is potentially used to attract a partner, but it's actually not part of the overall story, and it's not part of the reason for money. So in these types of circumstances, I think if we think about the types of identities that offenders use for romance fraud, we know from other research that they use professional identities. So using engineers, for example, using lawyers and doctors, kind of a high status occupation is quite an attractive identity in many instances. And I think the US military, or military in general, fits within that category, where there are reasons why people are attracted to that in terms of, I guess, just some stereotypes and thinking about an image of someone in the military around trustworthiness, around strength, around putting themselves on the line for others and sacrifice. I think that's really quite attractive for many people. So in this particular category of narrative, the needs were quite similar. They were exactly that of what we know of traditional advance fee fraud. So the reasons for money were around consignments and inheritances. They were around health emergencies, or if I've just had an accident and I need someone to pay my hospital bills. They were around, I've just been arrested and I need money to get out of jail. And as always, there's storylines around family assistance. So in many cases, they're widowed. We know that from broader research. But my child is in trouble, or my mother is in trouble, my father is in trouble, and I need money for those particular reasons. And there's many combinations of those categories as well. So in this particular, I guess, scenario, the military was just kind of incidental. It didn't feature heavily. and it was the more traditional advanced fee fraud narratives that were evident. So I've just got a few quotes up here, and I'm not going to read them all in detail, but these just demonstrate some of the excerpts taken from some of the free text narratives in the reports that were provided that provide some of the context and justification for why money was needed. So for the top one, we have the 40 gold bars, which we know is quite common across many of the advanced fee fraud approaches generally. The second one is around a suitcase of personal paperwork. The third one is around a back operation, so we're in the health emergencies area. And the last one is around the criminal justice. So the person's been accused, they're in jail, they need money for a lawyer, essentially. And all of that is framed around the relationship, around this idea of connection, of love, of future, of marriage, of being together, and therefore required on the victim's part to send money. So the second, I guess, category is where the military does feature and is at the forefront of, I guess, the overall story and the justification for financial requests. And for me, this was clearly the more interesting narrative. The other one is something that many of us are familiar with from previous research and what we already know. But in terms of looking at the military identity being kind of upfront and being integrated into the story from the offender, many of the reasons for money in this particular narrative were around leave requests, so encompassing recreational, retirement and safety. So this idea that I'm trying to take leave from the army, but I need to pay a fee in order to do that, or I need to process, I'm about to retire and I need some money to process my retirement, were very common. Also, the second category there is around supplies. So there were lots of requests for money that were based around food, medicine, phone and internet. And many examples, I guess, being that they're in a war zone, they're in an area where they can't access their own funds. The US Army or other military organisation isn't providing food. They're not providing any of the essentials. So if you as the victim don't send the money, then we can't communicate, then dire things will happen. So the justification in many cases was focused on, I guess, the security. And I think that's an interesting aspect that really is quite unique to that military narrative. So in many instances, offenders were able to invoke being in the military and the security and the secrecy associated with that. It was also able to cover them for periods of, I guess, isolation, where they just stopped engaging with victims for a period of time. They were able to explain that quite easily in terms of we're on an operation or we were here and I wasn't able to communicate. In many cases, offenders will use real world events so that if I were to Google a particular incident or a particular fight or conflict that happened, that I would find the evidence to support the story that's being provided by the offender. So I think in many ways the military narrative is actually, offenders can leverage it very well in terms of the unique characteristics of military service and being deployed in various locations globally to cover a multitude of justification on their part. So here are some quotes that support this one. So the top one is around special exit to leave the army and to move to be with the person. This notion that it costs money, that there's an administrative fee in order for the army to process leave requests, which isn't true. The second one is around, again, getting out of Afghanistan. So if I look at the timing of this one, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq were quite popular. I would imagine now, just based on current world events, that we will see many approaches framed around Ukraine now. We know that offenders do use events that are happening globally. So I have no, sadly, I believe in the future that offenders will be using stories around Ukraine and Russia and invoking the current conflict that's happening overseas in order to attract potential victims in this way. So the third point there is around no communication because they got sick and they were asking for money for toiletries. And the last one is around paying for the internet because the army was going to turn him off. So again, it's framed in terms of the relationship, the security and the relationship, and the fact that if you don't pay for these things, then my survival is at stake. And yeah, particularly for the leave ones, in terms of putting it on a future and putting it on a promise of marriage or a future relationship, that is quite a strong pull for many victims. Just a few more quotes here from this particular one. And I guess if you don't have knowledge around military activities, some of this may be plausible. So in terms of if you're on deployment in another country, that you may not have access to bank accounts in terms of security and privacy, and not leaving, I guess, a digital footprint, depending on what type of military service you're in and where you're deployed. Refusing to video call in many circumstances was popular, just because of the security risk that they're able to invoke around the operations that they say that they're involved in. So the covert nature of military service really does play well for offenders. So the second aspect that I want to talk about, which does relate, it does follow on from the military narrative, is around inauthentic identities. So this is based on a publication that I did with my PhD student, Rebecca Late. And again, it's published and open access if anyone's interested. And it's based on the same data set, so all the same caveats apply and all of the same descriptions apply in terms of the data for this particular analysis. So unsurprisingly, offenders don't use their own identities. They're often, they've taken on the identities of someone else. They've either taken on the exact identity. So Brian Denny, for example, has many circumstances where victims globally believe that they are dating Brian Denny, but also in many circumstances, the offender will take on a picture, a profile picture of Brian, but use a different name and a different identity as such. So individuals, potential victims, are often faced with situations where they do question the identity of the person that they're interacting with, and it's difficult in many situations, we know, in terms of the virtual environment, to authenticate, to know whether or not the person you're talking with is true or not. So this particular analysis explored the actions that individuals take in response to suspicions of inauthentic identities, and this also specifically focused on how we can improve prevention messaging. So for this analysis, there were 509 explicit reports that we drew upon, where the free text related to possible inauthenticity of the person that they were communicating with. And again, that was a manual coding process in terms of reading through the data, looking for some keywords such as suspicious, etc., and then compiling them together. So in terms of verifying or mitigating suspicions, a lot of this perhaps isn't surprising. It is common sense in many ways, that an internet search or third-party assistance are the two most common ways that people do try and verify or mitigate their suspicions. So internet searches could be quite successful in confirming suspicions. For example, if you are doing a reverse image search of Brian Denny, for example, it will come up with his profile, with the fact that there are many news stories that talk about the fact he is a victim. There are many websites that are dedicated to kind of outing offenders and have large collections of photos and identities used by offenders. So there's many ways that internet searches can be successful, whether it's a scammer website, whether it's a fact not checking out. I've had some really interesting interactions with victims who tell me kind of that moment that they had in finding out that the offender wasn't who they said they were. And the internet does play a role in that in some ways. For some victims, though, the internet search didn't find anything. There was no facts there, and there was nothing to say, I guess, for or against the individual. And in some ways, the lack of evidence didn't really always affirm the identity. So in some ways, not having a digital footprint was actually seen to be suspicious in and of itself. And I guess that's an interesting point if we just think about our lives now and the fact that most of us, I would say, probably do have a digital footprint of some sort, whether it's a social media account, whether it's other types of interactions that we do online, that it's probably a minority of people in some places that don't have that digital footprint. And it was just interesting to see how victims perceived the lack of digital footprint as suspicious in and of itself, that it has been created and perhaps the person isn't legitimate. But then on the flip side, that's also difficult for people who deliberately stay off the internet and who deliberately seek to maintain their privacy and confidentiality and anonymity, and how that could potentially, I guess, work against them in some ways. Third parties were also asked to investigate facts, and this included family, friends, and other organisations. So in some cases, this was useful, in some cases it wasn't. So there's some quotes here taken from the free text narratives, just around people doing Google search. And if you do a Google search of a person's name and kind of multiple photos come up or multiple identities come up, it might trigger a few red flags. The second one, same day I checked his photo for scammers, he is there. So that one was a photo that was on a scammer website, and the photo that they had received came up with scammer plastered across the photo on the actual scam website. People do send through, as we know, offenders send through all sorts of documentation, and in some cases the internet is able to verify or mitigate that in terms of what a passport should look like, in terms of what different documentation should look like. But I think that's difficult, because knowing, for example, when I've travelled to the UK and people have asked for my driver's license and I've shown that as my identity, and I get very strange and bizarre looks because they don't recognise my ID. It looks different to yours, and it's hard for someone to know whether or not it's a genuine piece of identification. And then the last one there speaks to that last point that I mentioned. I've searched Facebook and Google but can't find any information. It's like it doesn't exist in the real world. So that was more of, I guess, confirming suspicions rather than confirming the genuine nature of it. These quotes here talk about third-party assistance in terms of seeking assistance from family members or going to different organisations, particularly with the army. If we go back to the military narrative, there are many instances where individuals in the reports said that they'd contacted, whether it was the United Nations, whether it was military, whether the US military, different areas, to try and verify that this person actually did work there, was on deployment to where they said they were. And there's some challenges in that, simply because organisations won't necessarily confirm or deny the existence of individuals for privacy reasons. So there was some frustration on the part of victims that they were trying to verify particular aspects of a story, and they weren't always able to achieve that. And then there were a few, I think it was only one or two, where the complainants actually engaged a private investigator to figure out whether or not the person was true. I think what's really important around when we think of identity crime as well is the identity of the third parties that the offenders are appropriating. So the above really highlights that offenders don't use their own identities, but they take on those of others. And several of the reports highlighted the fact that many were reporting in order to try and alert authorities to the victim of the identity theft. So they weren't necessarily reporting on their behalf for the romance fraud, but they were concerned about somebody else's photo being used for these purposes. So there were some reports where the complainant, the victim, had actually tracked down the real person to let them know that someone was using their photo or was using their profile in different ways. And some people were able to determine the true identity of a person, for example. So if someone took my photo but was using a different name, they were able to figure out that it was me and potentially contact me to say your photo is being used in different ways. And in a small number of cases, complainants did actually call the person, or contact the person, I should say, to warn them. And I guess Brian Denny is a great example of that, where he's constantly receiving, notifications from different individuals, and constantly having to deal with the fact that his photos and his identities are being used hundreds, if not thousands of times globally to perpetrate fraud. So again, there's a few quotes here that I've taken just around looking at what individuals do and how they tried to either find the individual, or whether they've made contact, or whether they were just hoping that through their report that would occur. So just wrapping up now, romance fraud is a significant problem. We know that in terms of the stats. it's one that is escalating, and the current research that we have suggests that it is growing, and I think the pandemic has really played into that as well, and the fact that with the lockdowns, the physical restrictions, the inability to meet face-to-face meant that more and more people were conducting relationships online, and that provides a really good cover for offenders in terms of not being able to leave, not being able to meet in person, isolation, having COVID, all those types of things. I have so many friends and family and colleagues at the moment that are cancelling for all different reasons because everyone's in isolation and everyone's sick, and that's a global experience, so that does play into the hands of offenders. I think there's some really interesting insights we can learn from this around prevention messaging. So I haven't specifically, I guess, talked about it here, but if thinking about a Tinder swindler, for those of you that have seen it, one of the things that really strikes me from the current prevention messaging that we have with romance fraud is to never send money to someone that you haven't met in real life. That is advice here in Australia. I think it's through Action Fraud as well. It's through many agencies. And if we think about the Tinder swindler and how that was perpetrated in a face-to-face environment, that message is completely redundant. So I think we do need to think about some of the prevention messaging that we use for romance fraud and for fraud in general, and how offenders are really seeking to avoid that in many ways, and how the context has changed. I think particularly around the military narrative, I would be really keen to try and follow up with some of the victims in those circumstances just around their previous military knowledge, because it did come through in some of the comments that people connected because they had military personnel in their families, and that was what made them attractive in the first place. And they felt some justification and, I guess, authenticity around some of the stories that were being told. But in many other circumstances, I think just that lack of awareness about needing to pay administrative fees, for example, to go on leave, that's not a genuine reason why you should be asked to send money to someone. In terms of the identity, the use of inauthentic identities, I think it throws up some really interesting questions about some of the prevention messaging we have in that space. So, for example, I know a lot of there's a number of scam websites that are out there that seek to collect identities and profiles that have been used by offenders and put these on their websites with kind of scammer written across it. But I think that's also really problematic on the part of the person whose identity has been misappropriated, because they then have that kind of digital footprint or digital track that has their photo with scammer written across it. And it's not them who have perpetrated those offences. It's not those individuals, but they kind of have this footprint online that associates them with that in some very permanent ways. So I think that's an interesting discussion to have. The current analysis does provide what I think is some unique insights into romance fraud about how offenders are perpetrating the offences and how victims are responding. I think what was interesting about your inauthentic identities is the number of people who clearly do searches, and it does, I guess, lead to the fact that they are being defrauded. But it's the timing of the search. If individuals were doing those searches early on in the relationship, then potentially they wouldn't be sending such large amounts of money and could perhaps get out earlier. But a lot of these searches are happening weeks or months or a large investment down the track when it's actually too late to recover any losses, and it's more difficult for the victim to try and extricate themselves from that relationship and to actually believe that they have been defrauded and the damage has already been done. So I might just leave it there. I think I'm on my 40 minutes. So I can see there's some questions that have come through. But yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Cassandra. Some really great insights there into romance fraud. I mean, there are a few questions in the chat, so if anybody else does have questions, feel free to raise your hand, put those in the chat, and I'll get to you as and when we can. Before we do move to the chat, I just had a quick question, Cassandra, about the kind of the jurisdictional dynamics of these cases. In other words, did you find that in most of these cases there is almost always a cross-jurisdictional aspect, either in terms of the offender-victim relationship or in terms of the flows of the money and where they are sent to, if that makes sense?
Yep. So it's hard from this particular data set because not every complainant or victim kind of chose to record that. So it's very much kind of at the whim of what they thought was important. But I'd certainly say that there is a lot of cross-jurisdictional, particularly, I guess, in the military narrative. So in many circumstances, even if they said they were in the Australian Army, for example, they weren't based here in Australia. They were deployed overseas in Afghanistan in various places. And the US military narrative, I mean, that's clearly got an international aspect from an Australian victim perspective. The data that I do have wasn't only restricted to Australia though. So there was an ability for individuals to state whether they were Australian based or overseas, which was interesting. So I think it might have been kind of 3/4 were Australian and there was a quarter overseas, which again just highlights the global nature of this problem. In terms of money and where it was sent, again, victims who included a country, in many cases it was to obviously some of the West African countries, but there was also a focus around Asian countries. From an Australian perspective, a lot of our money does go to Asia. Yeah, it was global again. So I think the data really does emphasise the global nature of this, the interconnectedness of victims and offenders despite their physical jurisdiction. And as we know, that's just hugely problematic from a law enforcement perspective in terms of having jurisdiction and being able to do anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, Mike Levy, I think you were first in the chat. Did you want to pose your question directly to Cassandra, or do you want me to do it for you? If you're there, Mike. Oh, he's not coming in. So there's a couple of questions there for you, Cassandra. Well, the first one about how easy it is for military types to claim avoidance of true ID footprint.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a really good point. If we're thinking about, I guess, the military identity and the fact that for many individuals in those occupations and police as well, if we think a little bit more broadly, that they do limit their digital footprints, and particularly if they're in a covert position or if they're kind of on a secret squirrel mission somewhere in the world, that they're not necessarily advertising that and restricting a social media presence. And then on the flip side, we've kind of seen where even recently, I think in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, where social media has purportedly kind of placed individuals in particular areas because they haven't turned off location services, etc. So I think it's an important point, and I think it works to the advantage of the offender in terms of them being able to justify not having a digital footprint in some ways. And it's also difficult for actual personnel, military personnel, in many circumstances, whose identities are misappropriated to kind of justify and yeah, kind of in the aftermath of their identity being stolen, it's hard for them to kind of put things back together. But there is an organisation over in the US, Cybercrime Support Network, who does focus a lot on military, on veterans, specifically who have been victims of identity crime. So that's kind of a bigger issue in and of itself.
So this reminds me of the Strava issue when US military personnel were recording their exercise and activities in very sensitive areas across the globe where secret military bases were located, and then everybody who used the app could essentially see that for a period of time. So yeah, the importance of that secrecy is quite significant. And Mike had a second question around whether or not, or do we know what proportion of victims did these searches before they handed over money, or indeed before they discovered they had been scammed? So were people searching for people, beforehand?
So I guess, again, based on the data that I have, the majority of them had already sent money before they did the searches. And the searches, I guess, were what prompted them to realise that the person wasn't legitimate and that they had been defrauded. It would be good to try and increase that percentage in those initial stages, as I said, of individuals actually doing the searches in the kind of initial stages of the relationship where the trust and rapport is not as strong and they haven't lost as much money. But certainly the data that I have at this point in time, Most people were doing the searches down the track when something just wasn't feeling right. They had suspicions and they were then starting to investigate them.
Okay, on to Danny Dresner. I can see you put another comment there, Danny, saying that only selected participants can unmute. And I guess that means you're not a selected participant, or can you pose your question to Cassandra? You're not coming in, so I'll do that on your behalf. So Danny asked whether or not we have any data about how many people have been victim to the more extreme and less plausible backstories behind fraud. And he gives the extravagant example of the astronaut on the space station communicating with people and requiring money, which will be returned on their return to Earth, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, the Nigerian astronaut is an example that I use in several other presentations that I do, just in terms of, I guess, the outrageousness in some approaches. But I guess with that, what I would argue is that the majority of, if not all of the victims that I've interviewed, and I would say, I'm just thinking about the data that I currently have, they're not the stories, they're not the narratives that people are writing about, they're not the reasons why people are losing money. So I certainly don't disagree that they're not successful at all, but I think in some ways, for me, it's the stereotyped image of what a fraudulent approach looks like, and we kind of have this idea that it's these kind of gullible people that are responding and sending money to these types of approaches, whereas I would say it's more complex and nuanced in terms of the military narrative or just romance fraud in general, where it's making that connection and developing that trust and rapport with an individual with the promise of a future relationship and of companionship, and then leveraging that to get money. I think that's one of the most successful ways that offenders have figured out to make money. So I think back to when I started this over a decade ago, romance fraud was probably maybe 5 or 7% of victimization approaches. So the majority at that point was your more traditional advance fee fraud and investment approaches, at least here in Australia. And I think now, to conversations that I have with Queensland Police, and over 90% of their victimisation kind of category is around romance fraud. So it's significantly grown. And I think that's just because offenders have realised how effective it is, that it's easier to leverage a relationship than it is to try and get money in other ways.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, Mark, I think Mark Button, I think you do have access to your audio and camera. So if you'd like to ask a question of Cassandra.
Yeah, hi, Cassandra.
Hi.
Good to see you. Yeah, my question is around gender. Obviously, a lot of your analysis seems to be around the female victims, obviously attracted to the military figures. I wondered in your data set you had male victims as well, and how that differed, because obviously being a male and knowing a few victims of romance fraud who are males, I think that some of the things that probably motivate them to get involved are slightly different. So I'd be very interested to know if you had any of those victims in your data set.
Yeah, so certainly the sample itself, and you're testing my memory now, I can't remember off the top of my head the male-female breakdown of my entire sample. But for the military, I'm having a blank now, and I don't want to commit to anything. But certainly what I would say is that there was a category around sextortion that came up in the romance fraud data. And the sextortion reports, I've been doing a separate analysis on, and they're predominantly male. So the different narratives around sextortion and how it operates in a romance fraud context is very different between men and women. And we actually have a greater number of men who have reported that compared to women, even though that kind of may not be the assumption in some cases. I think in terms of romance fraud in the current data, there were male victims, because I am remembering there are a few cases where kind of the military narrative was a woman, so it was female military personnel, but it was heavy. It was certainly weighted towards the female victim and the male military person serving on deployment somewhere across the globe. I think it would be interesting to look at the gender differences around romance fraud, because even just drawing on the interviews that I've done with victims, they are very different stories that are told. And different reasons why people send money and kind of different, I guess, kind of themes that come through. So I would say it would be really beneficial to look at that in a bit more detail, to look at how it impacts men and women differently, and the narratives I would suggest are quite different, and that is, as you rightly point out, kind of the motivation that is different in terms of how men and women pursue relationships and what they're interested in.
Sure. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. David has a question, and I know you know David's work, Cassandra, on romance fraud, and I think he would like to pose the question himself, but it looks like he has COVID and is in bed, so unable to participate.
I'm so sorry.
As we were chatting about before, it's still quite rife across the UK. So here's a question about the about data reliability and of the available cyber-enabled fraud data that many academics are making use of in this area. So you mentioned your studies strongly rely on non-probability crowdsourced samples and police records that are also affected by underreporting and underrecording. So to what extent can we assume these data are good enough to be used in research and practice?
Yep, so I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. I think the data that I've used, I guess similar points can be made around the action fraud data from the UK that many of us rely upon. They do have their limitations. As to that last point, are they good enough to be used in research and practice? I would say yes, and the reason that I would say yes is because I think they do offer us some important insights into how this operates, some of the complexities and nuances that we see at that lower level. If we're looking at trying to determine prevalence of victimization across society and some of the impacts, I guess at a societal level, then I don't think that the type of data that we're currently using can really do that because of all the issues that you've identified. So we know that there's so many challenges with fraud data in terms of the quality of it, the recognition, I think, even of individuals that they've been defrauded in the first place. If you don't recognise that you've been a victim of fraud, then you're obviously not going to report it. The shame and the stigma around it really does act as a barrier in many cases as well. So there are absolutely limitations to it, but I think as long as we own those and as long as we're upfront with them in terms of the analysis and the findings that we do come up with, I do think that they do shed value on some of those, as I said, kind of complexities and nuances about how romance fraud operates at that individual level, looking at that, trying to look at patterns across many victims. I think there is value and benefit in that we can draw upon for prevention messaging and for disruption and other types of activities. It'd be great. Fraud data is, it'd be great if we had better sources of data, and I think for many of us, we would certainly welcome that, but it will always be a challenging area, perhaps more so than other crime types, but I mean, all data is inherently problematic in different ways, so we work with what we have.
Very true. Okay, there's an interesting question from Yang Lu about interventions and whether or not there are any data that show how different business models or the design of digital interventions used by social platforms can or could help prevention of romance fraud.
I think that's a really great question. Certainly my data, I don't think really does shed any light on that particular question, just in terms of it was complainants putting forward their narratives of what occurred. I think that there is more that can be done by many of the social media platforms and organisations out there. I do know, though, from my Australian experience and interactions with companies, with banks, with some online dating platforms, there is a lot of stuff, there is a lot of work that does happen behind the scenes. There's an increased use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, of algorithms, all the things that I don't understand. But they're clearly not working as efficiently as they could in some circumstances. Many companies, particularly if we think about the use of fraudulent profiles, there is a lot of work being done to try and identify and remove them. But at the same time, we know that offenders are constantly creating these fake profiles, and they're constantly being used to attract potential victims. So I've had some interactions with an online recruitment company in recent times who really do speak of the challenges in having processes in place to identify things, but also then I guess from their business perspective, it's this idea of convenience and security. So yeah, there's definitely some challenges and about finding the balance. But at this point in time, it's very clear that offenders are winning in many ways, that they're able to continue creating these fraudulent profiles. They're able to continue connecting with individuals. And clearly that's evident in the victimization stats that we have.
Great. Well, it's just coming up to 1 p.m, so we should bring the seminar to a close. So let me just finish by, well, on behalf of the attendees and on behalf of the centre as well, thank you, Cassandra, for presenting and sharing your analysis with us on romance fraud. It's been really insightful, and looking at the comments, it's certainly started a few discussions there, and there's a few further comments there around data sources such as from FIUs and so on, and an interesting chat about VAT fraud as well by the look of it, between Mike and Danny. But I think that might be an aside around paying electricians. So yeah, if any of you who in attendance today have enjoyed the seminar, please do check out our upcoming seminars, which are roughly once a month and usually around Wednesday lunchtime, depending on who the speaker is. So yeah, without further ado then, let me thank you again, Cassandra, and to all of you for participating. And I guess we can just hang around for a few more minutes if anybody has an urgent question or comment for Cassandra. Otherwise, thanks, and see you all next time.